Hello and welcome back to Community Economic Development. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the state approaches to economic development policy, and specifically about the 5 phases of economic development. And then I'm going to talk about the challenges and opportunities for economic development. State approaches range from a statewide tax or incentive plan to complicated programs that involve targeted incentives for specific industries. Some states might have a development plan, and others have state economic development offices. For example, here in Illinois, the State Economic Development Office is the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. These state offices of economic development have a responsibility generally of coordinating economic development activities between the various state agencies that relate to economic development. So for example, in California, you have the Employment Development Department has a role to play, again, with workforce development. You also have the Trade and Commerce Agency that had the primary lead role, and then offices such as the State Planning Office and so forth that administer regulations for development. So there has to be some kind of coordination between the state agencies to promote economic development within the state. Several of the commerce agencies at the state level also maintain offices in international places in other countries. So they have foreign trade offices and so forth to promote export, promote agricultural goods overseas and so forth. Another responsibility of these state agencies is they often develop marketing materials for the state, particularly to promote their incentive programs to businesses considering a location within the particular state. Another state approach is on efforts that concentrate on business retention, human skill development, and infrastructure. And those have been found to be most effective, particularly in a paper by Ted Bradshaw and Ed Blakely back in 1999. So your book talks about 5 waves of economic development practice, or 5 phases of economic development. The first is generally defined as industrial recruitment. And one way to think about this in particular is a supply side approach. In economics, generally we think of a supply side as an approach that reduces the cost. Whenever you reduce costs at all quantities, for example, right, it would shift the supply curve to the right and producing more quantity. And so when we offer things like tax incentives, the goal is to increase the amount of production. So the things that go under industrial recruitment in particular are things like creating a good business climate through reduction of taxes, provision of loans, provision of infrastructure subsidies, and so forth. On the negative side, sometimes this is referred to as greasing the skids for business. In particular, there's transaction costs with a move. So to make things easier to move, we would pay their moving costs and essentially make it easier for them to locate within the region. This has very much a corporatist paradigm. Often on the negative term, it's defined as smokestack chasing. One of the key aspects of this is very much centered on the area's export base, promoting the area's export base. And so it's generally the grand prize is a manufacturing company with lots of value added that's actually relatively footloose, but is going to be producing a surplus of which most will be exported to global markets. This phase came about particularly in the 1930s, very, very popular, particularly in the South. The second phase we're talking about is the political critiques of local economic development activity. And this came as a direct response to phase one. It started in the late 1960s. Again, there was a lot of question about whether these incentives that were provided in the first phase were effective, or whether they were actually creating new economic activity or just shifting things around. And when economic activity is just shifting around so that there's no real gain to national employment or national output or national value added, we refer to that as a zero-sum gain. So in other words, one region's gain is another region's loss. And so the belief is that firms became very good at understanding that how local entities would in essence bid for their location, and they would often play one against the other. So basically talking to multiple regions with their final decision already known or in their mind, just to basically get a bid competition going so that the place that they had already selected would offer a more generous set of incentives. So this second phase really began to focus on who is paying the costs of these incentives and who benefits from these. It saw the economic development actors really as political agents, involved a lot of political economic analysis. And again, the critique of the smokestack chasing was really arguing that it amounted to a zero-sum game. There was also recognition of tension between footloose capital and communities. So there was beginning to be that understanding that the objectives might be different for a firm and for what kinds of benefit would be returned to the communities. In the third phase, this was a phase of entrepreneurialism, and particularly this phase really emerged in the 1980s. Peter Eisinger wrote about it in his famous book, The Entrepreneurial State, in 1988. And this was an era where there was a dramatic shift from the exclusive reliance on the supply side techniques, the cost lowering techniques in phase one, to inclusion also of demand side techniques. And so one thing to keep in mind when we talk about the supply side versus the demand side, we're talking about it from the standpoint of the firm. So when we say supply side economic development, it means lowering the costs of the firm. When we say demand side, we're talking about increasing demand for the firm's product. So one of the things that these so-called new wave economic development or phase three economic development measures would be to try to create new markets. So marketing the goods of key manufacturing firms and sectors overseas. Also trying to develop the workforce of these agencies. Another aspect that this involved is a much more entrepreneurial action or behavior on the part of the governments as well. Under the phase one approach, typically incentives were just funded. In other words, nothing was demanded in exchange for the costs of the development project. Whereas what we began to see in phase 3 was governments demanding an equal partnership. And so we saw the rise of the private-public partnership, where the government would have a direct equity holding in the project. So they would have something in return. And so the language turned away from just funding a project towards financing, whereas again, collateral would be offered up, and again, the governments were behaving in a much more entrepreneurial fashion themselves. Additional approaches, again, were creation of new markets, very big. So expanding entrepreneurialism, incentivizing growing your own, again, training people to be entrepreneurs. Development of venture capital funds came into being. So having revolving funds available for business loans and providing the financing for capital for new startups, and particularly venture funds are in that intermediate range when they can expand on a new product, expand production, and go to that next phase of development. In addition to that, there is also the equity strategies that kind of coincide, and this is best demonstrated by Mayor Harold Washington of Chicago's efforts to enhance equity and redistribution amongst minorities, people that were traditionally excluded from business, and particularly excluded from participation in economic development. So there were also efforts to increase the level of equity. One thing I want to mention, as I've been mentioning these 3 phases kind of in time, it's important to understand that all of these phases still exist today. They go side by side. So even though, you know, in the early days in the 1930s, there wasn't much entrepreneurialism or demand side economic development on the part of the government, the supply side instruments that characterized the first phase still exist today, as well as the political critiques of local economic development. So none of these instruments and tools really go away. We just kind of expand them and layer them onto one another. So that said, the 4th phase is really characterized by, again, this criticism that the interests of the firm may be different from the interests of the community and workforce. And so the 4th phase encompasses sustainability and justice. So basically making sure that workers have a stake that's represented, and the community has a stake that is represented as well. Backing up to 2, I did want to mention, you know, a big critique of from again the political scientists at this time. One of the major ones was Malach's classic article, "The City as a Growth Machine," which argued that economic development activity was led by land-holding elites. So this is primarily your developers and the real estate community, often city newspapers and so forth, that had a stake in growth, and so they were promoting a lot of the land development efforts in an attempt to increase the values of land. And so that led to some of the negativism there as well. Again, some of the instruments, though, under the entrepreneurial strategy included international trade promotion, venture capital funds, and small business development. So growing your own kind of strategies. The third phase also incorporated identification, analysis, and promotion of industry clusters of related firms. This is really highly related in the entrepreneurialism as well, and kind of the push for regions to be the leaders, very closely related to Michael Porter's work in his 1990 paper on national competitiveness, or his book on national competitiveness. So as I mentioned before, in stage 3, how were states pushing for to expand exports overseas? Many states also opened up international offices, basically to promote their goods and to form relationships, basically to keep tariffs low and so forth in the other countries. I mentioned the importance of public-private partnerships during this time. And again, the key to understand this is governments often demanded an equity position in these deals. And one of the best known that I was familiar with, again, when I worked for the Employment Development Department, was joint venture Silicon Valley, which was a model for how they leveraged both workforce development and economic development instruments in a private-public partnership. Going back again to the fourth phase, sustainable economic development. Important to kind of understand, in particular, sustainability as the three-legged stool. And this basically is what Newby in a 1999 article is talking about, where the approaches to a sustainable approach to economic development yield social, economic, and environmental benefits. And that's basically the three prongs of what we mean by the term sustainability. Is there social equity? Is there economic growth, economic sustainability, in other words, prolonged economic growth? And is there environmental health, basically, in the process? So balancing economic development with social justice and environmentalism constitutes the three-legged stool of sustainability. This is also an era where brownfield development in particular became in vogue, again, to prevent the types of leapfrog development, avoiding those centrally located brownfields that had contaminated land and thus a potential liability. So spurring redevelopment of those sites that were previously contaminated. And then the fifth phase, this one's a little bit more trickier. It began in the 1990s, and it's described as being really centered on Porter's 1998 cluster work, identifying unmet demand and developing regional metropolitan strategies around competitiveness. This is really where you get into the idea. Again, it's closely related to number 3, and it's hard to really find that distinction. Porter's cluster strategies involve not just clustering of businesses, but the role of educational institutions, government institutions, collaborating together so that the region can compete on a global basis. So the whole idea is that by working together in terms and coordinating a regional and metropolitan-wide business strategy, the areas would be collectively stronger and able to outcompete foreign competitors. So again, the key of Michael Porter's strategy is somewhat similar to phase one, in that there is a focus on competitive advantage in that regard, whereas phase one is more restricted to a traditional, what we would call Ricardian strategy as far as comparative advantage, whereas 5 is really focused on an agglomerative type of strategy. So the challenges and opportunities for economic development that this creates, first and foremost, is an opportunity is that there's a high quality of life and community assets that need to be delivered, and so we need to look at things like quality housing and quality neighborhoods, the effectiveness of educational systems. We need to look at worker mobility. We need to examine the health and cultural facilities. So we're really looking at a much broader set of items today, rather than just strictly looking at the costs of business by firms in the area. Second, human capital is now recognized as the engine of development. Human capital, again, is just like any other input to production. It makes for innovation, and it makes for a higher valued product to be produced by the industry. So job creation now is based on pools that create activity. The focus in manufacturing, for example, now is on advanced manufacturers, but coinciding with artisanal manufacturing and 3D manufacturing today. The system today is global. This is both a negative challenge, right? It's kind of a threat, but it's also an opportunity, because that means that industries and firms in your local areas today are able to tap very large markets. So there's always an opportunity as well as a threat. Regional ties to the international economy today are much more significant, particularly in what we refer to as gateway cities, the coastal cities, much more significant than those to the domestic economy. And so we see like states, and particularly like California on the Pacific Rim, that have staunch differences with the rest of the economy. They feel much more tied into an international network than with the domestic economy. Other challenges are really severe for single industry communities. Single industry communities are extremely vulnerable, as we saw in Michigan. When the automotive industry began to decline, Michigan really struggled, and continues. Detroit continues to struggle today. Other places that have had single industry problems that have actually made a dramatic turn are Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was once the center of the steel industry, and today it's much more diversified. So there's got to be an effort to diversify communities that are locked into a single industry. That's a key aspect of economic development today. Labor market mismatch is a real difficulty that we're dealing with today. Labor market mismatch is a key source of unemployment. The types of mismatch can be either spatial. Sometimes they're spatial. We mentioned the issues of dislocation due to gentrification in central cities, pushing people, oftentimes minorities and poorer people, out further away from where maybe jobs are located. So there can end up being some type of spatial mismatch. But much more common is the skills mismatch. There's a mismatch of what people have the ability to do, the type of jobs they have to do. Some workers have only low-skilled talents that are no longer in demand. And so dealing with the types of training and education needed to enhance the productivity of all segments of the workforce is a tremendous challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity. And I mentioned the opportunities with the foreign-born workforce, for example, in bringing those segments of the labor market into full productivity and full participation is a tremendous challenge and opportunity. Access to raw materials is much less important today than agglomeration economies. Agglomeration economies built on knowledge spillovers are super important. It's less important that we're near the sources of raw materials. So for a car manufacturer, right, one of the reasons that Detroit became Motor City was basically its access to steel and so forth. So in its heyday, that was very important. Today, automobile assembly is occurring everywhere around the globe, as is almost everything else. All the big item assembly airplanes, aerospace can occur in a variety of places, or at least they can occur far away from any raw material sources, but they need to be close to human capital concentrations and agglomerations. Resiliency planning is a challenge for the future as Hurricane Katrina and other disasters, actually most recently the fires in California show. Disasters are going to happen much more frequently as a result of climate change. So it's incredibly important that your local communities have the ability to bounce back quickly from disasters, but also respond well in the midst of disasters. And so that constitutes a new area for economic development we refer to as resiliency planning, or preparing places to be more resistant to shocks, to be more and to bounce back quicker from disasters. Being the ability to identify assets and mobilize them, a hot topic in any local economic development plan. An early step is to do some kind of asset mapping, identifying what are the core opportunities, the core assets that we have in our community, that it gives us some kind of unique advantage, and taking those core community assets, whether they're a diverse workforce, whether they're unique cultural attributes, what have you, and channeling them into effective use, mobilizing them in a way that presents your community with its best face forward, its best stand, so to speak. Cluster development strategies are the wave of today. It's no longer about recruiting the individual firm, except in rare cases like maybe an Amazon.com. But now you're more likely to develop a whole cluster of interrelated businesses. Things will move in rather quickly and together, preserving, if it's the human capital network, or preserving, maybe it's a supply chain or what have you. So being able to understand the networks, the sources of network relationships, and being able to recruit by the cluster, not by the individual firms, is an important challenge and opportunity today. And then last, it's all about collaboration. So now you have firms that partner with one another to compete. You have government and universities working side by side with businesses in a way to hasten the transfer of technology to companies, in a way to evaluate what works, what's effective, using all of the assets and knowledge, capabilities, and skills available in universities, and putting them to use within the region to make that region much more competitive and stronger in the face of global competition. I have this in quotes, collaborating to compete, because this is, again, when I worked back at the Employment Development Department, it was actually the title of a report where we were restructuring our workforce development strategies to come in line with more cluster-focused initiatives, working again side by side, making sure that we're training the workforce exactly for the types of skills that can best lead to new product innovation, competitive advantage, and growth in a way that can compete globally. So in this lecture, I talked about the state approaches. This is the second half to the influence of national and state policies. We talked about the 5 phases in your book, and then I concluded with the challenges and opportunities for state and national economic development policy.